Hi, I'm Emma. 3 weeks ago, I was standing in the emergency room of Metro General Hospital when my sister Jessica rushed in, screaming at the triage nurse. Her 8-year-old daughter Sophie was having chest pains, and Jessica was demanding to see a real doctor, not some nurse. She pointed at me in my scrubs and said, "Make sure she doesn't touch my daughter. I don't want some glorified babysitter handling this." What she didn't know was that I wasn't just any nurse. I was the Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery who was about to save her daughter's life. But the real shock wasn't when I walked out of that operating room. It was watching Jessica's face when Dr. Mitchell, her own family physician, introduced me as the youngest department head in the hospital's history and the surgeon who just performed a miracle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the surgical recovery hallway cast everything in that cold hospital white that makes even the strongest people look fragile. I pulled off my surgical cap, feeling the weight of the last 4 hours settling into my shoulder. My hands were steady, the way they always were after a successful surgery, but my heart was doing something different. Something I hadn't felt in years. Through the glass doors of the family waiting area, I could see them, my parents, Maria and Carlos, sitting on those uncomfortable plastic chairs that every hospital seems to order in bulk. My father's work shirt was wrinkled from where he'd been gripping it, and my mother's rosary beads were wound tight around her finger. They'd been praying for 4 straight hours, the way they always did when life got bigger than their understanding. Jessica was pacing. Even in crisis, she managed to look put together in her designer jeans and that blazer she'd probably paid more for than most people's rent. Her husband David stood near the vending machines, still in his lawyer suit, checking his phone like he was expecting some urgent corporate emergency to pull him away from this family drama. They were all waiting for news about Sophie, waiting for someone to tell them whether my 8-year-old niece would live through the night. What they didn't know was that I'd already made that decision. In surgical suite 3, with my hands inside a child's chest cavity, I'd repaired a congenital heart defect that most surgeons wouldn't attempt on an adult, let alone a 3rd grader. I'd used a technique I'd developed myself, one that had been published in 3 medical journals, and had other cardiac surgeons calling it revolutionary. But to my family, I was just Emma, the quiet one who worked nights at the hospital, the one who couldn't afford the nice things Jessica had, who still drove the same Honda Civic from college, who lived in a modest apartment in Tempe instead of a gated community in Scottsdale. I pushed through the doors, still wearing my surgical scrubs. The conversation stopped immediately. All eyes turned to me, searching my face for answers about Sophie's condition. I could have savored this moment, could have let them wonder a little longer about who I really was. Instead, I just smiled and said, "She's going to be fine." That's when Dr. Mitchell appeared behind me. He'd been my attending physician when I was a resident, back when I was still Emma Rodriguez from Glendale who was trying to prove she belonged in an operating room. Now he was my colleague, though he still called me the miracle worker when he thought I wasn't listening. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, addressing Jessica directly, "I wanted to personally thank you for bringing Sophie here tonight. She's incredibly fortunate to have been treated by Dr. Emma Rodriguez, our Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery. She's the youngest department head in the hospital's history, and frankly, she just performed what I can only describe as a miracle." The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. It was the sound of assumptions crashing, of a lifetime of dismissal crumbling, of a family hierarchy that had been built on lies, suddenly revealing its foundation. Jessica's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the color draining from her face. She looked at me, then at Dr. Mitchell, then back at me, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing pieces. "Chief of Surgery," my mother whispered, her rosary beads finally still in her hands. I nodded, meeting Jessica's stare directly. "Cardiovascular surgery specifically. I specialize in pediatric cases." My father stood up slowly, his mechanic's hands hanging at his sides. "Mija, you never said." "I never said a lot of things, Papa." The transformation in the room was immediate. David put his phone away and actually looked at me for the first time in years. My parents moved closer, as if seeing me for the first time. And Jessica. Jessica looked like someone had just told her that gravity worked backwards. But you're a nurse, she said weakly. You wear scrubs, you work nights, you live in that tiny apartment. I am a surgeon, I corrected gently. I wear scrubs because I operate on people's hearts. I work nights because that's when emergencies happen. And I live in that apartment because I chose to. Dr. Mitchell smiled that proud mentor smile. Emma completed her residency at Mayo Clinic and graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins. She's published research that's changing how we approach pediatric cardiac surgery. Hospitals across the country are trying to recruit her. Jessica sank into one of those plastic chairs, her designer purse sliding off her shoulder onto the linoleum floor. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at each of them. These people who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. When would I have told you, Jessica, between the times you introduced me as my sister, the nurse at parties, or maybe during those family dinners when you explained to everyone how I should have chosen a more ambitious career path? The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge had been burning for years. Emma, my mother said softly, we're proud of you. We've always been proud. No, Mama. You've been proud of Jessica, the pharmaceutical sales rep with the BMW in the big house, the one who married the lawyer and had the perfect family. I was just Emma who worked at the hospital. David cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. We had no idea you were so accomplished. Accomplished, I repeated, tasting the word. Is that what we're calling it? Through the glass I could see Sophie sleeping peacefully in her recovery bed. Monitors beeping steadily around her. She looked so small under those white hospital sheets, but her color was good. Her heart was beating strong and steady, pumping blood through arteries I'd reconstructed with precision that had taken me 15 years to develop. She's going to need follow-up care, I said, switching back into doctor mode. I'll want to see her in 2 weeks, then monthly for the first year. The surgery was successful, but we'll need to monitor her progress closely. Jessica looked up at me with eyes that were finally seeing clearly. You operated on Sophie, you saved her life. I did my job. No, she said, standing up on unsteady legs. You did more than that. She struggled for words, and for the first time in our entire relationship, Jessica Rodriguez was speechless. That's when I realized something had shifted permanently, not just between us, but inside me. For years I'd hidden who I was to avoid their judgment, their questions, their expectations. I'd made myself small to fit into their understanding of who I should be. But standing there in that hospital hallway, still wearing the scrubs I'd worn to save my niece's life, I understood that I was done shrinking. I was done apologizing for being more than they thought I could be. I need to check on my patient, I said, because Sophie was my patient now, not just my niece. The night supervisor will have all the discharge information when she's ready to go home. I turned to walk away, but Jessica's voice stopped me. Emma, wait. I paused but didn't turn around. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Thank you for saving my daughter. I looked back at her then, this sister who had spent our entire lives, making me feel like I wasn't enough. She was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks, designer purse still on the floor where she'd dropped it. You're welcome, I said simply. But Jessica, next time someone in scrubs offers to help your daughter, maybe don't assume they're not qualified. The silence followed me as I walked back through those glass doors, past the nurses' station where Pat Johnson gave me a knowing nod, past the elevator that would take me up to my real office on the 12th floor, the one with my name on the door and my medical degree on the wall. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe fully in my own family's presence. The secret was out, the performance was over, and somehow, despite everything, Sophie was going to be okay. That was 3 weeks ago. What happened next changed everything, not just between Jessica and me, but in ways I never could have expected, because it turns out that when you spend years hiding who you really are, the truth doesn't just set you free. Sometimes it rewrites everything you thought you knew, about family, about love, and about the price of being seen for who you really are. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to that moment in the recovery hallway, You need to know how it all began. You need to understand why I chose to hide in plain sight, why I let my own sister believe I was something I wasn't, and why sometimes the biggest lie you tell is the one you tell yourself about what you deserve. It started on a Thursday morning in October, when the desert air was just beginning to cool and the city of Phoenix was settling into that brief season, when living in Arizona feels like a gift instead of an endurance test. I was driving to work in my Honda Civic, the one Jessica always wrinkled her nose at when she saw it in our parents' driveway, listening to a podcast about new developments in minimally invasive cardiac procedures. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Family dinner Sunday. Don't wear scrubs. Try to look presentable for once. I should have been used to it by then. The casual dismissal, the assumption that my appearance was somehow a reflection of my worth, the way she spoke to me like I was a teenager who couldn't figure out how to dress myself, rather than a 30-year-old woman who had spent the previous evening repairing a man's aorta. Instead, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that had been there since we were kids, and she'd correct my English in front of her friends, or explain to our relatives why I was the quiet one who kept to herself. What Jessica didn't know was that I'd been keeping to myself for very good reasons, and what she was about to discover was that some secrets are worth keeping until the moment they're not. The early morning light filtered through the blinds in my apartment, casting long shadows across the medical journals scattered on my coffee table. I sat curled up in my favorite armchair, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, listening to the gentle hum of the city waking up outside my window. Phoenix in October was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, just that sweet spot where you could leave your windows open and let the desert air remind you why people fell in love with this place. My apartment wasn't much to look at from the outside, a modest two-bedroom in a complex that had seen better days, wedged between a Dairy Queen and a laundromat in Tempe, the kind of place where college students lived, where people were just starting out, or just getting by. Jessica had made it clear on more than one occasion that she didn't understand why I'd chosen to live there when I could do better for myself. What she didn't see was the way the morning sun hit my kitchen table perfectly for reading, or how the courtyard fountain created just enough white noise to help me concentrate after long shifts. She didn't know about the elderly woman next door, Miss Chan, who brought me homemade dumplings when she noticed I'd been working too many nights in a row. She didn't see the small herb garden I'd cultivated on my balcony, or the way I'd arranged my books and medical text to create a space that felt like home. This was my sanctuary, the place where I could shed the careful anonymity I wore at the hospital and just be Emma, not Dr. Rodriguez. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rodriguez, not the chief of surgery, not the woman who held people's hearts in her hands and made life or death decisions before most people had their first cup of coffee. Just Emma, who liked to read mystery novels on Sunday mornings, and who had taught herself to cook authentic Mexican food from YouTube videos, because she missed her grandmother's recipes. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the messages that had accumulated overnight. 3 from the hospital patient updates that could wait until I got to work, 1 from my mother reminding me about Sunday dinner at Jessica's house, and 1 from Dr. Sarah Kim, my closest friend at the hospital and the only person who knew the full story of why I kept my 2 worlds so carefully separated. Coffee later, I have gossip about the new resident who keeps hitting on everyone in the ER. Sarah's text read. I smiled and typed back. Can't. Family dinner tonight. Wish me luck. Oof. Need backup. I can fake a medical emergency. Tempting, but I'll survive. Always do. The family dinners had become a monthly tradition ever since Jessica had bought her house in Scottsdale. She'd invite our parents, sometimes David's family, occasionally cousins, or aunts who happened to be in town. They were elaborate affairs, catered food, perfectly set tables, the kind of entertaining that appeared effortless, but probably took Jessica hours to coordinate. I usually showed up in whatever I'd thrown on after my shift, ate quietly while everyone else talked about their jobs and their accomplishments, and left as soon as it was socially acceptable. It was a delicate dance we'd all learned over the years, this careful navigation around the fact that I was the family member who didn't quite fit the narrative Jessica had constructed about our success. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Jessica was arranging flowers and planning menus, I was often coming off shifts where I'd literally held human hearts in my hands. While she was worried about impressing David's colleagues, I was making decisions that would determine whether children would grow up to have families of their own. But in the world Jessica had created, those things didn't matter because they weren't visible in the right way. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was still early, but I knew I needed to start getting ready, not just physically, but mentally. These family gatherings required a kind of emotional preparation, a way of girding myself for the subtle questions and comments that would inevitably come my way. The shower water was hot against my skin, and I let myself stand there longer than necessary, letting the steam fill the small bathroom. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Sarah a few weeks earlier, when she'd asked me point blank why I didn't just tell my family the truth about my job. "What's the worst that could happen?" she'd said over Vietnamese food at our favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurant. "They find out you're successful? They realize you're not the struggling little sister they think you are." I'd tried to explain it to her, but the words had felt inadequate. How do you tell someone that you've built your entire adult life around avoiding the expectations that success would bring? How do you explain that sometimes being invisible is safer than being seen? "It's not about being ashamed," I'd said finally. "It's about being Sarah had looked at me with that expression she got when she was trying to solve a particularly difficult case. Free from what, exactly? I'd stirred my foe and thought about how to answer that. Free from having to be what they think successful looks like. Free from having to justify my choices or defend my life. Free from becoming the person they want me to be instead of the person I actually am." She'd nodded slowly, but I could tell she still didn't entirely understand. Sarah came from a family that celebrated achievement, that talked openly about their successes, and supported each other's ambitions. She'd grown up in a world where being good at something was met with pride, not suspicion. My family wasn't like that, not because they didn't love me, but because success in our house had always been a complicated thing. My parents had immigrated from Mexico when Jessica and I were small, and they'd worked multiple jobs to give us opportunities they'd never had. Success to them meant stability, it meant safety, it meant not drawing too much attention to yourself. Jessica had figured out how to thread that needle. Her job in pharmaceutical sales was impressive without being threatening. She made good money, but not so much that it made people uncomfortable. She'd married David, who was successful in that white-collar country club way that our parents could understand and be proud of. She'd bought a house in a nice neighborhood, and had a beautiful daughter and threw dinner parties where everything looked perfect. I had become a surgeon. I had dedicated my life to a profession that required me to make decisions other people couldn't handle, to work hours that most people found incomprehensible, to carry a level of responsibility that could break you if you let it. I'd chosen a path that was messy and complicated and beautiful and terrible, sometimes all in the same day, and I'd never figured out how to make that fit into the story my family wanted to tell about themselves. So I'd made a different choice. I'd let them see the parts of my life that made sense to them, the scrubs, the night shifts, the modest apartment, the careful way I spent money. I'd let them fill in the gaps with their own assumptions, and I'd never corrected them when those assumptions made me smaller than I actually was. It wasn't entirely their fault. I'd been complicit in creating this version of myself, this Emma who was quiet and unassuming and who didn't challenge anyone's expectations. It had been easier in many ways than having to explain why I'd chosen such a demanding career, why I wasn't married, why I didn't want the kind of life that looked successful from the outside. But lately, I'd been feeling the weight of it, the constant code switching, the way I had to remember to be less articulate around my family, the careful way I avoided mentioning the cases I'd worked on, or the research I was doing. It was exhausting to live in two worlds that never quite touched. I dried my hair and chose my clothes carefully. Not too nice, because that would prompt questions about where I'd gotten the money for them. Not too casual, because Jessica would make some comment about how I should make more of an effort. I settled on dark jeans and a sweater that was presentable without being remarkable. The drive to Scottsdale always felt like traveling between worlds, from my comfortable lived-in neighborhood to Jessica's carefully curated suburban paradise. where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it had been designed by the same architect. I'd made this drive hundreds of times, but it never got easier. I pulled into the circular driveway behind David's Mercedes and sat in my car for a moment, watching the house through my windshield. It was a beautiful house, honest, Spanish-style architecture with a red tile roof and mature palm trees that provided shade for the front courtyard, the kind of house that said we've made it without being ostentatious about it. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving around inside. My parents were probably already there, my father uncomfortably dressed in his good shirt, my mother helping Jessica with last-minute preparations even though Jessica had insisted she didn't need help. David would be checking sports scores on his phone, and Sophie would be upstairs in her room, probably playing some game on her tablet. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, grabbing the bottle of wine I'd brought, and checking my reflection in the car window one more time. I looked like exactly what I was supposed to look like, Emma Rodriguez, the younger sister who worked at the hospital and lived modestly and who didn't cause any trouble. The front door opened before I could knock, and Sophie came running out, her dark hair bouncing as she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Tia, Emma, you're here." I hugged her back, feeling some of the tension in my shoulders. This was always the best part of these gatherings, Sophie's uncomplicated joy at seeing me, her chatter about school and friends and whatever book she was reading. She was 8 years old and brilliant, with Jessica's dramatic flair and David's analytical mind, and she was the only person in the family who never seemed to have any expectations about who I should be. "How's my favorite niece?" I asked, ruffling her. "I'm your only niece," she said, rolling her eyes in that way kids do when adults say something they think is silly. "Which makes you even more special," I replied, and she grinned and grabbed my hand to pull me inside. The house smelled like the expensive candles Jessica bought, mixed with the aroma of whatever elaborate meal she'd had catered. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, my mother's gentle laugh, my father's accented English, Jessica's animated storytelling voice that meant she was probably describing some work drama or social event. "Emma's here," Sophie announced as we walked into the kitchen, and everyone turned to look at me with those polite, expectant smiles that family gatherings seem to require. My mother immediately crossed the room to hug me, speaking in the mixture of Spanish and English that was our family's natural language. "Mija, you look tired. Are you eating enough? You're working too much." "I'm fine, Mama," I said, returning her hug and inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with cooking spices. "Just busy at work." "She's always busy at work," Jessica said, not looking up from where she was arranging something on a serving platter. "Some of us have learned to find balance." The comment hung in the air for just a moment, the way Jessica's comments always did. Not quite an insult, not quite a criticism, but something that made me feel like I needed to defend choices I hadn't been asked to justify. "Balance is different for everyone," I said, mildly, handing her the wine I'd brought. She took it, and glanced at the label. "Oh, this is not—" "Where did you get it?" "The store," I said, which was true but not the whole truth. I'd actually bought it at a wine shop near the hospital that specialized in small batch vintages, recommended by a colleague who'd spent a year working in France. But explaining that would lead to questions about why I was shopping at expensive wine stores, which would lead to conversations I didn't want to have. David appeared from the living room, still in his work clothes but with his tie loosened. "Emma, good to see you. How's the hospital treating you?" "Can't complain," I said, accepting his brief hug. David was always perfectly polite to me, in that way that lawyers are polite to everyone. Pleasant but not particularly warm, cordial but not curious. "Still working nights?" he asked. "Mostly." "That must be rough." "I don't know how you do it." I smiled and didn't mention that I'd chosen the night shifts because they paid more, and because some of the most interesting cases came through the emergency department after hours. "You get used to it." My father joined us, looking slightly uncomfortable in his dress shirt and slacks. He'd worked with his hands his entire life, first as a mechanic and then in construction, and he never quite looked at ease in social situations that required him to stand around making small talk. "How's work, Papa?" I asked him, grateful for the change of subject. "Good, good. Busy. Miss Itunez's car is making that noise again, the one I told her about 6 months ago. She thinks if she ignores it, it will go away."
I laughed. Some problems get worse if you don't address them. Exactly. You understand, you work with people, you know how they are. Jessica glanced over at us. Speaking of work, Emma, are you still planning to stay in nursing long term? I mean, you're almost 30. At some point you might want to think about moving up, doing something with more responsibility. The question was asked in that concerned sister tone that Jessica had perfected, the one that made it sound like she was looking out for my best interests while simultaneously suggesting that my current situation was somehow inadequate. I felt my mother's eyes on me, waiting for my response. Sophie had wandered over to listen, probably picking up on the subtle tension that had entered the conversation. I like what I do, I said simply, but don't you want more? I mean, you're smart enough to do anything. You could go back to school, get an MBA, move into hospital administration, or you could do something completely different. It's not too late to change careers. The conversation felt like it was happening in slow motion. I could see my parents nodding slightly, probably thinking that Jessica was making sense, that maybe I should want more than what I could see David checking his phone, only half listening, but ready to contribute some comment about career advancement if called upon. And I could see Sophie watching me, with those bright, curious eyes, waiting to see how I would respond to this suggestion that what I did with my life wasn't quite enough. I'm happy where I am, I said, keeping my voice steady, but are you challenged? Are you growing? I just worry that you're settling, you know, that you're not reaching your potential. Jessica's voice was gentle, but her words hit like small stones, not big enough to cause serious damage, but persistent enough to wear you down over time. This was how it always went with her. The loving concern that came wrapped around the suggestion that I wasn't living up to some standard she'd set for me. I looked around the kitchen, at these people who loved me, and who thought they knew what was best for me, and I felt that
Heart rate 140, blood pressure 90/60. Oxygen saturation 94% on room air. We've got her on monitors, but she's scared and her parents are. He paused. They're pretty upset. Sophie, my niece Sophie. I was pulling on scrubs before I'd even fully processed what the resident had told me. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Get me a complete cardiac workup. EKG, chest X-ray, echocardiogram, and page Dr. Kim in cardiology. Already done. Dr. Kim is on her way. I hung up and grabbed my keys, my mind racing through possibilities. Chest pain in children was usually nothing serious. Anxiety, muscle strain, sometimes asthma. But something about the way the resident had described Sophie's presentation made my stomach tighten with concern. The drive to the hospital was a blur of empty streets and traffic lights that seemed to take forever to change. I parked in the physician's lot and ran through the automatic doors, my badge swinging from the lanyard around my neck as I headed straight for the emergency department. The scene I walked into was exactly what I'd expected, and nothing like I'd prepared for. Jessica was standing near the nurse's station, her voice rising as she spoke to whoever would listen. She was still in her pajamas, expensive silk ones that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. But her hair was disheveled and her face was pale without its usual careful makeup. I don't understand why this is taking so long, she was saying to Pat Johnson, the night charge nurse who'd been at Metro General longer than I'd been alive. My daughter is in pain, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. David stood behind her fully dressed despite the hour, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in the low, urgent tones that meant he was probably calling in favors or trying to expedite something through his connection. My parents were there too, looking small and scared in the harsh fluorescent lighting. My mother was clutching her rosary beads, her lips moving in what I knew was constant prayer. My father stood with his hands in his pockets, that helpless expression on his face that came when life presented problems that couldn't be fixed with tools and hard work. And then there was Sophie, visible through the glass doors of Trauma Bay 3, lying on a gurney that made her look even smaller than her 8 years. She was hooked up to monitors, their rhythmic beeping filling the air with an electronic soundtrack of anxiety. I approached the nurse's station, and Pat looked up at me with relief. Dr. Rodriguez. Thank God. Room 3. The parents are. She gestured vaguely at Jessica, who was now pacing back and forth in front of the vending machines. I can see that. What do we know? Pat pulled up Sophie's chart on the computer screen. Woke up around 2 a.m. complaining of chest pain. Parents brought her straight here. Initial EKG shows some irregularities, but nothing immediately life-threatening. We're waiting on the echo results. I nodded, reviewing the preliminary data. Sophie's symptoms were concerning, but not immediately critical. Still, something about the pattern of her heart rhythm on the monitor made me uneasy. Has anyone talked to the family about what we're seeing? Dr. Stevens tried, but the mother, Pat, lowered her voice. She's been pretty demanding, keeps asking for the best doctor available, and making comments about wanting someone with real qualifications to look at her daughter. I felt my jaw tighten. Of course Jessica would do that. Even in crisis, she couldn't help but express her opinions about who was and wasn't qualified to help her family. I'll handle it, I said, heading toward Trauma Bay 3. Sophie's face lit up when she saw me walk through the doors. Tia, Emma, you're here. I moved to her bedside, immediately focusing on her condition while trying to project the calm confidence that scared children needed from their doctors. Hey, sweetheart. I heard you're not feeling very good. My chest hurts, she said, her voice small but brave. It feels like there's something squeezing my heart. I took her hand, feeling for her pulse while studying the monitors above her bed. Her heart rate was elevated but not dangerously so. More concerning was the irregular pattern I could see on the EKG read. Can you tell me when it started hurting? I asked, pulling my stethoscope from around my neck. I woke up and it was hard to breathe. And then it started hurting right here. She pointed to the center of her chest. I listened to her heart, hearing the subtle irregularity that the monitors were picking up. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it wasn't normal either. In an adult, I might have attributed it to stress or anxiety. In a child Sophie's age, it suggested something more serious. Sophie, I'm going to take very good care of you, okay? We're going to run some tests to figure out what's going on, and then we're going to fix it. She nodded solemnly, trusting me in the way children do when adults speak to them with honesty and respect. That's when I heard Jessica's voice outside the room, louder now, and more insistent. I don't care what the policy is. I want to speak to whoever is in charge. My daughter needs to be seen by a real doctor, not some resident who looks like they graduated yesterday. I closed my eyes for a moment, preparing myself for what was about to happen. Then I stepped outside the trauma bay. Jessica saw me immediately, and her expression shifted from angry to confused. Emma? What are you doing here? I'm here to see Sophie, I said calmly. Did someone call you? I mean, I know you work here. But, she looked around, as if trying to figure out how I'd gotten involved in her daughter's medical care. David had finished his phone call, and was walking toward us. Emma, thank God. Can you find out what's going on? No one will tell us anything concrete, and Jessica is worried sick. I looked at both of them, these people who knew me as their sister and sister-in-law, who had never seen me as anything more than the family member who worked at the hospital in some vague, non-specific capacity. I'm Sophie's doctor, I said simply. Jessica's eyebrows rose. Her doctor? But you're a... She paused, seeming to realize that she wasn't sure exactly what I was. I'm a cardiac surgeon, and based on Sophie's initial presentation, she needs to be evaluated by someone who specializes in pediatric heart conditions. The silence that followed was different from the usual family dinner silence. This one was sharp, confused, filled with questions that no one seemed to know how to ask. Cardiac surgeon, David repeated slowly. Yes, Jessica was staring at me like I'd just told her I was an astronaut. But you're a nurse, you wear scrubs and work nights. And I am a surgeon, I said, my voice steady but firm. I wear scrubs because I operate on people's hearts. I work nights, because that's when emergencies happen. And right now, your daughter needs my expertise. My parents had moved closer, drawn by the sound of our conversation. My mother looked bewildered, my father curious but cautious. Mija, my mother said softly, you never told us you were a doctor. I never told you a lot of things, Mama. Jessica was shaking her head, as if trying to process information that didn't fit into her understanding of the world. This doesn't make sense. If you're a surgeon, why do you live in that apartment? Why do you drive that car? Why don't I what? Jessica, Why don't I live the kind of life you think successful people should live? Kim appeared at my elbow, her presence immediately commanding attention. Sarah was one of those people who radiated competence, and her arrival seemed to shift the energy in the hallway. Emma, I've reviewed the echo results. We need to talk. I nodded, grateful for the interruption. Family, this is Dr. Sarah Kim, our head of cardiothoracic surgery. Sarah, this is my family. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She knew about my family situation, but she'd never met any of them in person. Pleasure to meet you all. Emma, can we step into the consultation room? As we walked away, I could hear Jessica's voice behind us, higher now, and more confused. Head of cardiothoracic surgery, but Emma said she was. I said I was a cardiac surgeon. I corrected without turning around. Which I am. The consultation room was small and windowless, the kind of space where difficult conversations happened. Sarah closed the door behind us and pulled up Sophie's test results on the computer screen. It's not good, Emma. The echo shows a significant septal defect that's been putting strain on her heart. It's congenital, probably been there since birth, but it's reached the point where it's causing symptoms. I studied the images, seeing immediately what Sarah was pointing out. Sophie had been born with a hole in the wall between the chambers of her heart, and over the years, the extra work her heart had been doing to compensate had begun to take its toll. Surgery? I asked. Definitely, and soon. The good news is that it's repairable, and with her age and overall health, she should have an excellent prognosis. The bad news is that it's complex enough that it needs to be done by someone with extensive pediatric cardiac experience. I nodded, already mentally preparing for the procedure. I'll take the case. Sarah looked at me carefully. Are you sure? I mean, this is your niece. That's a lot of pressure, even for you. She needs the best surgeon available, I said. And ego aside, that's me. Okay, but Emma, your family. She gestured toward the door, where we could still hear the murmur of confused voices. This is going to change everything for them. I thought about that for a moment. For years I'd carefully constructed a version of myself that fit into my family's expectations. I'd been the quiet sister, the one who didn't cause trouble, who didn't challenge anyone's assumptions about success or ambition. I'd let them see me as smaller than I was, because it was easier than explaining why I'd chosen a life that didn't look like what they thought success should look like. But now Sophie needed me. Not Emma the sister or Emma the nurse, but Dr. Emma Rodriguez, the cardiac surgeon who specialized in exactly the kind of case that could save her life. You're right, I said finally. It will change everything, but Sophie comes first. Sarah nodded. I'll prep the How do you want to handle the family conversation? I took a deep breath. Honestly, for the first time in years I'm going to tell them the truth. When we walked back into the hallway, Jessica immediately approached us, her face tight with anxiety. What did you find? Is Sophie okay? I looked at each of them. Jessica with her designer pajamas and her perfectly maintained facade of control. David with his phone still in his hand as if he could somehow negotiate a solution to this problem. My parents with their worried faces and their rosary beads, and their lifetime of trusting that somehow things would work out. Sophie has a congenital heart defect, I said. She was born with a hole in her heart that's been getting bigger over time. It's why she's been having chest pain and shortness of breath. Jessica's face went white. A hole in her heart. But she's been fine. She's been healthy. She plays soccer. Children are remarkably good at compensating for heart problems, I explained. But Sophie's reached the point where her heart can't keep up with the extra work it's been doing. She needs surgery to repair the defect. Surgery? David's voice was sharp with concern. What kind of surgery? How serious is this? It's serious, but it's also completely repairable. The procedure is called a septal defect repair, and it involves closing the hole in Sophie's heart with a patch. In the hands of an experienced pediatric cardiac surgeon, it has an excellent success rate. An experienced pediatric cardiac surgeon, Jessica repeated. And you're saying I'm saying I'm the person who's going to save your daughter's life. The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of years of assumptions and misunderstandings. For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica Rodriguez was completely speechless. My mother broke the silence. Mija, you can fix Sophie's heart? Yes, Mama, I can fix Sophie's heart. And in that moment, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency department hallway, surrounded by the people who had spent my entire adult life thinking they knew who I was, I realized that everything was about to change. The secret I'd been keeping for years was about to be revealed, not in some dramatic family confrontation, but in the most natural way possible, because someone I loved needed me to be exactly who I was. Part 4. The dignified withdrawal. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been years in the making. I could see the wheels turning in Jessica's mind, trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the person standing in front of her claiming to be a cardiac surgeon. The overhead lights hummed softly, mixing with the distant sounds of the emergency department, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the quiet conversations of medical staff going about their work. I need to prepare for Sophie's surgery, I said, my voice calm and professional. The procedure is scheduled for first thing in the morning, which gives us time to run a few more tests and make sure she's stable overnight. Jessica opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. She looked like someone who'd been handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing, trying to make sense of a picture that kept changing every time she thought she understood it. Emma, David said slowly, I think we need to understand exactly what's happening here. Are you saying you're going to operate on Sophie? I'm saying I'm the surgeon who's going to repair her heart. Yes, but he gestured vaguely at my scrubs, my ponytail, the way I looked like any other hospital employee walking through the halls at 3 a.m. You're our sister. You live in that apartment in Tempe. You drive a Honda Civic. I am your sister, I agreed. And I do live in that apartment. And I do drive that car. I also happen to be the Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery at this hospital, and I specialize in pediatric cardiac procedures. My mother stepped forward, her dark eyes searching my face. Misha, why didn't you tell us? The question was asked without accusation, but with the kind of gentle confusion that came from a lifetime of thinking she understood her daughter's life. I looked at her, this woman, who had worked 2 jobs to put Jessica and me through school, who had sacrificed so much to give us opportunities she'd never had, and I felt the weight of all the conversations we'd never had. Because I didn't want to complicate things, I said complicate things. Jessica's voice was rising again, that edge of hysteria creeping back in. You let us think you were just a nurse. You let us worry about your career, your future, she gestured wildly. Everything. I let you think what you wanted to think, I corrected. I never lied to you about what I did. I told you I worked at the hospital. I told you I worked nights. I told you I took care of people. You filled in the rest with your own assumptions. Assumptions. Jessica's laugh was sharp and bitter. You were deliberately misleading. I was protecting myself. The words came out before I could stop them, more honest than I'd intended to be. The hallway fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different, heavier, more dangerous. Protecting yourself from what? David asked, his lawyer's instincts picking up on the implication that there was more to this story. I looked at each of them, these people who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. I thought about all the family dinners where Jessica had explained to relatives why I was the quiet one, who kept to herself. I thought about the Christmas parties where she'd introduced me as my sister the nurse, with that particular tone that made it clear she was being generous by not adding unfortunate. I thought about the countless small moments where I'd been made to feel like my life was somehow less than what it should be. Protecting myself from this, I said, gesturing at the confusion and disbelief on their faces, from having to justify my choices, from having to explain why I live the way I live, or why I choose to spend my time the way I choose to spend it, from having to be the person you think I should be, instead of the person I actually am. Jessica stared at me. That's not fair. We never asked you to be anything other than yourself, didn't you? I kept my voice gentle, but I could feel years of accumulated hurt rising to the surface. At every family dinner, every birthday party, every holiday gathering, there were questions about when I was going to do something more with my life, comments about how I should be thinking about my future, about finding a better job, about not settling for less than I deserved. You told me I should go back to school, get an MBA,
move into administration. You told me I was smart enough to do anything, which implied that what I was doing wasn't enough. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hands deep in his pockets. We only wanted what was best for you, Mija. I know, Pop, but what's best for me isn't the same as what looks best to everyone else. Jessica was shaking her head, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled from running her hands through it. This is insane. You're telling me that you've been lying to us for years because you were afraid we'd be proud of you. I'm telling you that I've been living my life the way I wanted to live it, and I didn't want to have to defend those choices to people who had already decided they weren't good enough. The accusation hung between us like a challenge. Jessica's face flushed, and I could see her struggling between indignation and the uncomfortable recognition that there might be truth in what I was saying. That's not, she started, then we never said your choices weren't good enough. You didn't have to say it, Jessica. It was in every suggestion that I should want more, every comment about how I was too smart to be satisfied with what I had, every time you introduced me to your friends as someone who was still figuring things out. My mother reached for my hand, her touch gentle but uncertain. Emma, we love you. We've always loved you. I know you love me, Mama, but love and acceptance aren't the same thing. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, her eyes filling with tears that she tried to blink away. I need to check on Sophie, I said, feeling the weight of the conversation settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat, and I need to prepare for her surgery. I turned toward the trauma bay, but Jessica's voice stopped me. Wait, her voice was quieter now, less certain. If you're really a surgeon, if you're really qualified to operate on Sophie, then why are you working here? Why aren't you at some prestigious hospital in California or New York? I turned back to face her, seeing genuine curiosity in her expression for the first time in years. Because this is where I want to be. Because Metro General has one of the best cardiac programs in the Southwest. Because the work I do here matters, and the patients I see here need me. But you could make more money somewhere else. You could have a better title, more recognition. I have the title I want. I make enough money to live the life I choose to live, and I get all the recognition I need from my patients and my colleagues. But don't you want more? The question was asked with such genuine bewilderment that I almost smiled. This was the heart of it, the fundamental difference between Jessica and me that had shaped every interaction we'd had since childhood. She couldn't understand how someone could have opportunities for more money, more status, more visible success, and choose not to take them. I have everything I want, I said simply. I have work that challenges me, colleagues who respect me, patients who need me, and a life that feels authentic to who I am. What more could I possibly want? Jessica stared at me, like I was speaking a foreign language. But the apartment, the car, the way you live, I live the way I want to live. I don't need a big house or an expensive car to feel successful. I don't need other people to see my success for it to be real. But what about marriage, kids, a normal life? The question revealed so much about how Jessica saw the world, about the narrow definition of success and happiness that had guided her own choices. I thought about how to answer her, how to explain that the life she saw as normal wasn't the only way to be happy. I have a life that makes me happy, I said. It might not look like your life, but it's the right life for me. David had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Emma, I think what Jessica is trying to understand is why you would choose to hide all of this from us. If you're successful, if you're happy, why the secrecy? I looked at him, this man who had never really seen me as anything more than Jessica's quirky younger sister, and I tried to find words that would make him understand, because the moment I told you the truth, everything would change. You'd start treating me differently, expecting different things from me. You'd want to know why I made the choices I made, why I didn't make the choices you thought I should make. You'd start giving me advice about my career, my personal life, my future, and I'd become the person you thought I should be, instead of the person I actually am. But we're your family, Jessica said, her voice smaller now. We want what's best for you. What's best for me is being able to live my life without having to justify it to anyone. What's best for me is being seen for who I am, not who you think I should be. The conversation was interrupted by Pat Johnson approaching with a clipboard. Dr. Rodriguez, I need your signature on Sophie's surgical consent form. She handed me the clipboard, and I could feel my family watching as I reviewed the document. The forms were routine, standard surgical consent, anesthesia, authorization, post-operative care instructions, but seeing my name, printed at the top as the attending surgeon, seemed to make the reality of the situation hit home for all of them. Rodriguez, my father said quietly, testing out the title like he was learning a new language. I signed the forms and handed them back to Pat. Thank you. Is the OR scheduled for 7 a.m.? Yes, ma'am. Dr. Kim will be assisting, and we've got your usual team on standby. Good. I'll want to see Sophie once more before she goes up, and I need to speak with anesthesia about her pre-op medications. Pat nodded and walked away, leaving us alone in the hallway again. But something had shifted in the last few minutes. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a more complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite read on their faces. Your usual team, Jessica repeated. How long have you been doing this? 5 years as chief of surgery, 3 years before that as an attendant. Before that, residency and fellowship. Jesus, Emma, you've been a surgeon for almost a decade, and we had no idea. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of those years of secrecy was settling on me now, all the careful misdirection and half-truths that had allowed me to keep my two worlds separate. I need to go check on Sophie, I said finally, and then I need to get some rest before her surgery. Can we? Jessica hesitated. Can we see her before the surgery? Of course, she's your daughter. I meant all of us. As a family. I looked at her, surprised by the request. In all the years I'd been working at Metro General, my family had never visited me here. They'd never seen me, in my professional environment, never met my colleagues, never witnessed the work that had become the center of my life. If you want to, I said. We walked together toward Trauma Bay 3, and I could feel the shift in dynamics as we moved through the hospital. Nurses who passed us in the hallway nodded respectfully to me, some of them stopping to ask about other patients or to clarify orders. Residents approached with questions about cases they were working on. The security guard at the elevator greeted me by name. I could see Jessica taking it all in, the way people deferred to me, the casual authority I exercised in this environment. It was like watching her realize that her little sister had been living an entirely different life in plain sight. Sophie was awake when we entered her room, looking small but alert in the hospital bed. She brightened when she saw all of us together. Is everybody here because I'm sick? She asked with the directness that only children could manage. Everybody's here because we love you, my mother said, moving to her bedside and taking her hand. Tia Emma is going to fix my heart, Sophie announced proudly. She's a doctor, not just a nurse like I thought. The innocence of the statement seemed to crystallize everything that had happened in the last few hours. Sophie had simply accepted the new information about who I was, and moved on, the way children do when adults complicate things unnecessarily. Jessica sat down in the chair beside Sophie's bed, her face softening as she looked at her daughter. Are you scared, baby? A little, Sophie admitted. But Tia Emma explained everything to me. She said she's going to put a patch on my heart to fix the hole, like when you put a patch on my jeans when they get torn. I smiled at the memory of that conversation. It was one of the things I loved about pediatric medicine, the way children could understand complex medical procedures when you explained them in terms that made sense to their world. That's exactly right, I said. And after we fix the hole, your heart won't have to work so hard anymore. You'll feel much better. Will I be able to play soccer again? You'll be able to do everything you did before, only better. Your heart will be stronger. Sophie nodded solemnly, then looked around at all the adults surrounding her bed. Why does everyone look so serious? Tia Emma said. The surgery is going to work, because we love you, David said, speaking directly to his daughter for the first time since we'd arrived. And when someone you love is going to have surgery, you worry about them. But you don't have to worry, Sophie said with the confidence of a child who trusted the adults in her life to take care of everything. Tia Emma is the best doctor in the whole hospital. The nurses told me so. I felt my throat tighten at her words. Sophie's faith in me was absolute, uncomplicated by any of the family dynamics that had made this revelation so difficult for the adults. The nurses are very smart, I said, managing to keep my voice steady. Dr. Rodriguez, a voice called from the doorway. I turned to see Dr. Martinez, one of the anesthesiologists I worked with regularly. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to go over Sophie's pre-op plan with you. Of course, I turned to my family. I'll be right back. The conversation with Dr. Martinez was brief but necessary. We discussed Sophie's weight, her medication allergies, the anesthesia protocol we'd use for her age and condition. It was the kind of routine consultation that happened before every surgery, but I was aware that my family was watching through the glass, seeing me in yet another professional interaction that reinforced the reality of who I was in this environment.
The certainty in my voice seemed to surprise her. She nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding that the sister she thought she knew had been living a completely different life. "Okay," she said. "Okay." I looked at each of them one more time. "I need to go home and get some sleep. The surgery is scheduled for 7 a.m., and it will take about 4 hours. You can wait in the surgical family lounge, and someone will update you every hour." "Emma?" my mother said, reaching for my hand again. "Thank you for taking care of Sophie. She struggled for words. "For being who you are." I squeezed her hand gently. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mama." As I walked away from them, heading toward the elevator that would take me to the parking garage, I could feel the weight of the last few hours settling into my bones. The secret I'd kept for so long was finally out, but I wasn't sure yet what that meant for any of us. The drive home was quiet. The streets empty except for the occasional late-night worker heading home or early morning commuter starting their day. I thought about Sophie, sleeping peacefully in her hospital bed, trusting me to fix her heart. I thought about my family, probably still standing in that hallway, trying to process everything they'd learned about the person they thought they knew. And I thought about myself, about the woman who had spent years hiding in plain sight, protecting herself from expectations and judgments that might not have been as harsh as she'd imagined. Tomorrow, I would walk into that operating room and do what I'd trained my entire adult life to do. I would repair Sophie's heart with hands that had been shaped by years of study and practice and dedication. I would save her life, and in doing so, I would finally step fully into who I was meant to be. But tonight, I drove home to my modest apartment in Tempe, to the life I'd chosen, and the peace I'd found in being exactly who I was, whether anyone else understood it or not. The truth was finally out, and despite everything, despite the complicated emotions and the difficult conversations that were still to come, I felt lighter than I had in years. The hospital never truly slept, but there was a hushed efficiency to the way things moved in those quiet hours. Before sunrise, I arrived at 5:30 a.m., 2 hours before Sophie's scheduled surgery, because this was how I prepared for the cases that mattered most, the ones where failure wasn't an option. I badged into the physician's lounge, a space that existed in a different world from the one my family had seen the night before. Here, surrounded by the lockers and benches and coffee makers that marked the boundary between our public and private professional lives, I could finally drop the careful facade I'd maintained for so many years. Dr. Sarah Kim was already there, reviewing Sophie's chart one final time. She looked up when I entered, her expression a mixture of professional focus and personal concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked, closing the tablet and giving me her full attention. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then paused. "Actually, I'm not sure. Last night was a lot," Sarah finished. "I can imagine. How did they take it?" I opened my locker and began changing into fresh scrubs, considering how to answer that question. About as well as you'd expect. Jessica looked like I'd told her I was secretly an alien. My parents seemed confused but proud. David was calculating whether this changed his opinion of me. Sarah laughed softly. "And how does it feel?" Finally having them know, I tied my hair back and considered the question. "Different. Scared. Like I've been wearing a costume for so long that I forgot what it felt like to just be myself. Well, today you get to be yourself in the most important way possible. You get to save your niece's life. That was the thing about Sarah that I valued most. She had a way of cutting through the emotional complexity to focus on what mattered. Today, what mattered was Sophie. Walk me through it one more time, I said, pulling on my surgical cap. We spent the next hour reviewing every detail of the procedure. Sophie's septal defect was complex but not unusual. A hole in the wall between her heart's chambers that had been there since birth, gradually causing her heart to work harder than it should. The repair involved placing a patch over the hole, allowing her heart to function normally. On paper it was routine. In reality it was a delicate procedure that required precision, experience, and an understanding of how a child's heart differed from an adult's. The margin for error was smaller, the stakes higher, the need for perfection absolute. Dr. Rodriguez, a resident, appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. Your 7 a.m. case is being prepped. The family is in the surgical waiting area. I nodded, checking my watch. In 15 minutes I would walk into operating room 3 and begin the procedure that would either confirm my family's new understanding of who I was, or destroy it completely. The preoperative area was a controlled chaos of activity. Nurses checking equipment, and anesthesiologists reviewing medication protocols, surgical technicians arranging instruments with the precision of a military operation. This was my world, the place where I was most completely myself. Sophie was already on the gurney, looking impossibly small under the heated blankets. She was drowsy from the pre-medication but still alert enough to recognize me when I approached. "Tia Emma," she said, her voice slightly slurred but happy. "Are you ready to fix my heart?" "I'm ready," I said, taking her hand. "Are you ready to let me?" She nodded solemnly. "Mom said to tell you that she trusts you." The words caught me off guard, more meaningful than Jessica probably realized. Trust wasn't something that had come easily between us over the years. "Tell your mom I won't let her down," I said. "I already know you won't," Sophie said with the absolute confidence of a child who had never been disappointed by the adults in her life. The anesthesiologist began the induction, and I watched Sophie's eyes flutter closed as the medication took effect. In a few minutes she would be completely dependent on my skill and judgment. The weight of that responsibility was something I'd felt hundreds of times before, but it was different when the patient was family. "All right, people," I said as we wheeled Sophie into the operating room. "Let's go fix this little girl's heart." OR 3 was a cathedral of technology and precision. The lights were positioned perfectly, the instruments laid out in the exact order I preferred, the monitors displaying Sophie's vital signs in real time. This was where I was most at home, where years of training and experience crystallized into the kind of focused clarity that made complex surgery possible. I took my position at the table surrounded by the team I'd worked with for years. Each person knew their role, understood the rhythm of how I worked, anticipated what I would need before I asked for it. This was the kind of collaboration that made Metro General's cardiac program one of the best in the region. "Scalpel," I said, and the familiar weight of the instrument settled into my hand. The initial incision was always the moment when a case truly began. Everything before was preparation. Everything after was execution. I made the cut with the kind of precision that had taken years to develop, opening Sophie's chest to reveal the heart that I would spend the next several hours repairing. Working on a child's heart was different from working on an adult's in ways that went beyond the obvious size difference. Everything was more delicate, more vulnerable, more precious. The margin for error was smaller, the consequences of any mistake more catastrophic. It required a level of concentration that blocked out everything else: the family waiting in the lounge, the revelation of the night before, the complicated emotions that came with operating on someone you loved. For the next 4 hours I existed in a state of complete focus. My hands moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Placing sutures with the accuracy of a master craftsman, I repaired the hole in Sophie's heart with a patch that would grow with her, ensuring that this problem would never recur. Beautiful work, Doc. Kim murmured as I placed the final sutures. Textbook perfect. I stepped back from the table, finally allowing myself to breathe fully for the first time since the surgery had begun. Sophie's heart was beating strongly, her vital signs stable, the repair complete. Let's get her to recovery, I said, pulling off my surgical gloves. I want to monitor her closely for the first few hours. As the team prepared to transfer Sophie to the cardiac recovery unit, I walked to the observation window where I knew my family would be waiting. They were all there. Jessica pacing near the coffee machine, David checking his phone, my parents sitting quietly in the corner, their faces etched with the kind of worry that only comes from watching someone you love undergo surgery. I pushed through the doors of the waiting area, still in my surgical scrubs, and the conversation stopped immediately. They all turned to look at me, searching my face for answers about Sophie's condition. The surgery was successful, I said, and I could see the relief wash over them like a physical wave. Sophie's heart is repaired, and she's stable. She'll be in recovery for a few hours, and then we'll move her to the cardiac unit for monitoring. Jessica sank into one of the waiting room chairs, tears streaming down her face. She's okay. She's really okay. She's going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. The repair means her heart won't have to work so hard anymore. She'll have more energy, better stamina, and she'll be able to do everything any other 8-year-old can do. My mother crossed herself and whispered a prayer of gratitude. My father stood up and walked toward me, his expression serious. Mija, he said, I need to say something. I waited, not sure what to expect. I'm proud of you, not just for saving Sophie, but for who you are. I don't understand why you felt you had to hide this from us, but I'm proud of the woman you've become. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. My father had never been demonstrative with his emotions, and hearing him say that he was proud of me felt like a gift I hadn't known I was waiting for. Thank you, Papa. David approached, his usual lawyer's composure replaced by genuine emotion. Emma, I owe you an apology, not just for today, but for years of not seeing you clearly. I had no idea who you really were. You saw who I let you see, I said. That's not entirely your fault. Jessica looked up at me from her chair, her makeup smeared but her eyes clear. Why? She asked. Why did you hide all of this from us? It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, the question that would require me to explain not just what I'd done, but why I'd felt I needed to do it, because I was afraid, I said simply. Afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd expect me to be someone different. Afraid that my success would change how you treated me, how you saw me. Afraid that I'd lose the freedom to live my life on my own terms. But we're your family, Jessica said, echoing her words from the night before. We love you. I know you love me, but love and acceptance aren't always the same thing. And sometimes, the people who love us the most are the ones who have the hardest time accepting that we might want something different than what they want for us. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. I made you feel like what you were doing wasn't good enough, didn't? The admission was painful for both of us. You made me feel like I should want more than what I had, like the life I'd chosen wasn't ambitious enough, successful enough, impressive enough. I thought I was encouraging you, I know, but sometimes encouragement feels like criticism when it's based on the assumption that what you're doing isn't enough. We were interrupted by a nurse from the recovery unit. Dr. Rodriguez, your patient is awake and asking for you. I looked at my family, these people who had just learned that their understanding of me had been incomplete for years. Would you like to see her? We walked together through the hospital corridors, past the nurses' stations and treatment rooms that made up my professional world. I could see them taking it all in, the way staff members greeted me, the casual authority I exercised, the respect I commanded from colleagues and subordinates alike. Sophie was sitting up in her recovery bed, looking groggy but alert. Her color was good, and the monitors showed strong, steady vital signs. When she saw us, her face lit up with that uncomplicated joy that only children could manage. Tia, Emma, you fixed my heart. I moved to her bedside, checking her incision, and reviewing her chart. I did. How do you feel? Different, she said thoughtfully. Like I can breathe better. That's exactly right. Your heart doesn't have to work as hard anymore, so everything else can work better too. Jessica approached the bed, her eyes full of tears. Hi, baby. How are you feeling? Good. Tia Emma took really good care of me. All the nurses said she's the best doctor in the whole hospital. Jessica looked over at me, her expression complex. They're right, she said quietly. She is. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical monitoring and family conversation. Sophie's recovery was progressing exactly as it should, and I was able to explain to my family what to expect in the coming days and weeks, the technical aspects of her care, the follow-up appointments, the activity restrictions that would gradually be lifted as her heart healed. But beneath the medical discussions, there was a deeper conversation happening, a reckoning with years of assumptions and misunderstandings, a recognition that the relationships we thought we understood had been built on incomplete information. As the day wore on, visitors began to arrive, colleagues who had heard about the surgery, friends who knew Sophie, extended family members who had been called with updates. Each new arrival reinforced the reality of who I was in this environment, adding another layer to my family's understanding of the life I'd been living. Mitchell, the hospital administrator, stopped by in the late afternoon. Dr. Rodriguez, I heard about your niece. How is she doing? Very well, thank you. The repair was successful, and she's recovering beautifully. I'm not surprised. You do excellent work. He turned to Jessica. You must be very proud of your sister. She's one of our most valued surgeons. Jessica nodded, still processing the cognitive dissonance of hearing her little sister described as one of our most valued surgeons. She's remarkable, Dr. Mitchell continued. We've had offers from hospitals across the country trying to recruit her, but she's committed to staying here. Says she likes the community feel, the ability to really know her patients. After he left, Jessica turned to me. Hospitals are trying to recruit you. A few, I admit. Johns Hopkins offered me a position last year, so did Cedars-Sinai and Mass General, and you turned them down. I like it here. I like the work I do, the people I work with, the patients I treat. Success isn't always about taking the biggest offer or the most prestigious position, but the money. I make enough money. More than enough, actually. I don't need to make more money to feel successful. It was a fundamental difference in how we saw the world, and I could see Jessica struggling to understand. In her worldview, success was measured by external markers: salary, title, recognition, lifestyle. In mine, success was measured by internal satisfaction, the work itself, the impact on patients, the alignment between my values and my choices. As evening approached, Sophie's condition continued to improve. Her vital signs were stable, her pain was well controlled, and she was alert and comfortable. The critical period immediately after surgery had passed successfully. I think you can all go home and get some rest, I told my family. Sophie's going to sleep through the night, and there will be nurses monitoring her constantly. What about you? My mother asked. When will you go home? I'll stay for a few more hours, make sure everything continues to go well, then I'll go home. Jessica hesitated at the door. Emma, can I talk to you for a minute, privately? We stepped out into the hallway, leaving the rest of the family with Sophie. I need to apologize, Jessica said without preamble. Not just for today, but for years of making you feel like you weren't good enough. I had no idea I was doing that, but that doesn't make it okay. I could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, the recognition that her well-intentioned encouragement had felt like criticism to me. I also need to thank you, she continued, for saving Sophie's life, for being exactly who you needed to be when she needed you most. I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been here. You don't need to thank me for that, I said. She's my niece. I love her. I know, but you could have referred her to someone else. You could have stepped back and let another surgeon handle it. Instead, you put yourself in a position where you had to reveal everything you'd been keeping private. She was right. I could have handled Sophie's case differently, could have maintained the secret I'd been keeping for years. But the moment I'd seen her in that hospital bed,
There had never been any question about what I would do.
Some things are more important than keeping secrets,
I said. Jessica nodded, tears in her eyes. I have a lot to think about how I've treated you, about what I thought I knew about success and happiness, and what makes a life worth living.
We all do.
Will you forgive me for not seeing you clearly, for making you feel like you had to hide who you were? I looked at my sister, this woman who had shaped my life in ways, both positive and negative, who had loved me, and frustrated me, and pushed me to be better, even when her definition of better didn't match mine. There's nothing to forgive, I said. We're family. We're still figuring out how to love each other well. She hugged me then, and for the first time in years, it felt like she was hugging the real me, not the version of me she thought she understood. As my family left for the night, I returned to Sophie's room for one final check. She was sleeping peacefully, her small body finally at rest after the trauma of surgery. Her heart was beating steadily, the repair I'd made already allowing her cardiovascular system to function more efficiently. I stood there for a long time, watching her sleep, and thinking about the day that had changed everything. The surgery had been successful, but the real transformation had happened outside the operating room. My family now knew who I really was, and I was finally free to be that person without hiding or apologizing. The secret was out, the performance was over, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe fully in my own skin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new ways of relating to each other based on truth instead of assumptions. But tonight, Sophie was safe, my family knew who I was, and I had finally stepped fully into the life I'd been living in the shadow. The truth had set me free, in ways I hadn't expected, and despite the complexity of the emotions involved, despite the difficult conversations still to come, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I was finally, completely, myself. 3 months after Sophie's surgery, I was sitting in my office on the 12th floor of Metro General, reviewing research proposals for a new pediatric cardiac program, when my assistant knocked on the door. Dr. Rodriguez, your sister is here to see you. I looked up from the stack of papers, surprised. Jessica had never visited me at work before, not in all the years I'd been at Metro General. Since Sophie's surgery, our relationship had been slowly rebuilding, but we were still finding our way back to each other. Send her in. Jessica entered my office, and I could see her taking in the space with fresh eyes. The diplomas on the wall, the medical journals on my desk, the awards and recognitions I'd received over the years, all the evidence of the life I'd been living that she'd never seen before. This is your office, she said, not quite a question. This is my office. She sat down in one of the chairs across from my desk, looking uncharacteristically nervous. I brought you some. She handed me a small wrapped package, and I opened it to find a picture frame containing a photo I'd never seen before. It was from Sophie's 8th birthday party, taken just 2 weeks before her surgery. In the photo, Sophie was laughing at something off camera, her face bright with joy and completely unaware of the heart condition that would soon change everything. I found it when I was going through photos for her scrapbook, Jessica said. I wanted you to have it because you gave me the chance to see her laugh like that again. I studied the photo, remembering that day. I'd been there for the party, playing the role of the quiet aunt, who worked at the hospital. Sophie had been tired that day, I remembered now, though none of us had understood why at the time. Thank you, I said, setting the frame on my desk where I could see it. She's doing well, she's doing amazing. Her energy is incredible. She's playing soccer again, and she made the honor roll. Her cardiologist says her heart is perfect. I smiled, thinking of my last appointment with Sophie. She'd been full of questions about how hearts worked, about what I did all day, about whether she could be a doctor when she grew up. Her curiosity was infectious, and her recovery had been textbook perfect. There's something else, Jessica said, her voice taking on that careful tone she used when she was building up to something important. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about success, and happiness, and what makes a life worth living. I waited, sensing that she needed to work through whatever she was trying to say. I've been so focused on the external markers of success, that I forgot to ask whether I was actually happy, whether the life I'd built was the life I wanted, or just the life I thought I was supposed to want. She paused, looking out the window at the Phoenix skyline. David and I have been talking about making some changes. I'm thinking about leaving pharmaceutical sales, maybe going back to school. I want to do something that feels more meaningful. What would you study? Social work, maybe, or counseling, something where I can help people instead of just selling them things. She laughed, but it was self-deprecating. I know it sounds crazy, giving up a good salary to start over in a field that doesn't pay well. It doesn't sound crazy at all. It sounds like you're figuring out what success means to you. I think I am, and I think I owe you an apology for not understanding that sooner. Jessica had been apologizing to me in various ways for months now, but this felt different, more complete somehow. You know what's funny? She continued. I spent so many years worried that you weren't ambitious enough, that you weren't reaching your potential, but you were already living the life you wanted. You were already successful in the ways that mattered to you. Success is personal. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. I'm starting to understand that, and I'm starting to understand why you kept your career private. You were protecting something precious. She was right. I had been protecting something precious, the freedom to define my own life, to measure my own success, to be happy without having to justify that happiness to anyone else. How are Mom and Dad handling all this? I asked. Jessica smiled. Dad brags about you to everyone now. He's got copies of your medical journal articles in his toolbox, and he shows them to customers whether they're interested or not. Mom has been telling everyone at church that her daughter is a heart surgeon. The image of my father carrying around my research papers made me laugh. He probably doesn't understand half of what they say. He doesn't, but he's proud anyway. And Mom, Jessica paused. Mom feels bad that she didn't know. She keeps saying she should have asked more questions, should have been more curious about your work. I thought about my parents, these people who had worked so hard to give Jessica and me opportunities they'd never had. They'd been proud of us in their own ways, but they'd also been limited by their own understanding of what success looked like. They did the best they could with what they knew, I said. We all did. Sophie wants to be a doctor now, Jessica said, changing the subject. She's been reading books about the heart, asking questions about medical school. She says she wants to fix people's hearts like you do. She's got plenty of time to figure out what she wants to do, but if she does decide to go into medicine, I'll be here to help her navigate it. She adores you, she always has, but now she understands why you're so special. I felt a warmth spread through my chest at the thought of Sophie, this bright, curious child who saw the world with such clarity. She'd been through so much in the past few months, but she'd emerged stronger and more determined than ever. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about, Jessica said, her tone becoming more serious. David and I have been discussing it, and we'd like to ask you to be Sophie's godmother. Officially. The request caught me off guard. Official. We know you've always been important to her, but we want to make it formal. We want her to know that you'll always be there for her, no matter what happens. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about what that would mean. To be officially recognized as someone who would help guide Sophie through life, who would be there for the important moments and the difficult ones. I'd be honored, I said finally. Jessica smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt completely genuine. Good, because she's already picked out a dress for the ceremony. We talked for a while longer about Sophie's recovery, about Jessica's career plans, about the ways our family was slowly learning to see each other more clearly. When she finally left, I sat alone in my office, looking at the photo she'd brought me. Sophie's laughing face reminded me of why I'd chosen this profession in the first place, not for the recognition, or the money, or the prestige, but for moments like the one captured in that photo, for the chance to preserve joy, to protect innocence, to give children the opportunity to grow up and discover who they were meant to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Kim. Dinner tonight. I want to hear about your family visit. I texted back, absolutely, I have news. As I prepared to leave for the day, I thought about how much had changed since that night, in the emergency room, when my two worlds had finally collided. My family knew who I was now, but more importantly, they were learning to accept that who I was had always been enough. The secret was out, but the real revelation hadn't been about my career, or my accomplishments. It had been about the courage to be authentically yourself, even when that authenticity didn't match other people's expectations. I gathered my things and headed toward the elevator, passing the same nurses' stations and treatment rooms where I'd worked for years. But now I moved through these spaces with a different kind of freedom. I was no longer hiding any part of myself, no longer code switching between the person I was at work and the person I was with my family. I was just Emma, Dr. Emma Rodriguez, Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, Sophie's aunt, and soon-to-be godmother, daughter, sister, friend, surgeon, woman who had finally learned that the most important person to be proud of you is yourself. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, ready to go home to my modest apartment in Tempe, to my herb garden, and my medical journals, and my quiet life that was exactly as full and meaningful as I'd always known it to be. Outside, the Phoenix sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I felt a deep sense of contentment settle over me. This was my life, not the life anyone else had planned for me, but the life I'd chosen for myself. And for the first time in years, I could live it without having to hide any part of who I was. The truth had set me free, but more than that, it had brought my family closer together. We were learning to love each other not despite our differences, but because of them.
We were learning that there were many ways to be successful, many ways to be happy, many ways to make a life worth living. And Sophie, bright, curious, resilient Sophie, was learning that she could be anything she wanted to be, as long as she had the courage to be authentically herself. That night, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and a medical journal, I thought about the letter I'd received earlier that week from a colleague at Johns Hopkins. Another job offer, another opportunity to move to a more prestigious hospital, another chance to advance my career in ways that would impress people who measured success by external markers. I'd already drafted my response, a polite decline along with a recommendation for another surgeon who might be interested in the position. Because I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, living exactly the life that made me happy. Some people might not understand that choice. Some people might think I was limiting myself, settling for less than I deserved. But I'd learned that the only opinion that mattered was my own. I was Dr. Emma Rodriguez, and I was exactly who I was meant to be. The next morning, I arrived at Metro General to find an unusual scene in the lobby. Sophie was there with Jessica and David, along with my parents and what looked like half our extended family. They were all wearing their best clothes, and Sophie was holding a bouquet of flowers. Surprise! Sophie called out when she saw me. "We're here for Take Your Family to Work Day." I looked at Jessica confused. "Take your family to work day?" "Sophie's idea," Jessica said, smiling. "She wanted to see where you work, meet the people you work with, understand what you do all day. She's been planning this for weeks," my mother added. "She made us all promise to come." Sophie ran up to me, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can you show us your office and the operating room and introduce us to the other doctor?" I looked around at my family, these people who had spent years thinking they knew who I was, but had never seen me in my professional environment. They were here not because they had to be, but because they wanted to understand this part of my life that had been hidden from them for so long. "I'd love to," I said, taking Sophie's hand, "but we have to follow the rules. Hospital tours are serious business." "I know," Sophie said solemnly. "I've been reading about hospital safety protocols." Of course she had. This was the child who had asked for medical textbooks for her 9th birthday, who had started a science club at school, who had decided that she wanted to understand everything about the world around her. The tour lasted 3 hours. I showed them the cardiac unit, the surgical suites, the research labs where I worked on developing new procedures. I introduced them to my colleagues, explained what different departments did, answered Sophie's endless questions about how hospitals work. My parents were amazed by the technology, by the complexity of the equipment, by the sheer scale of the medical care that happened within these walls every day. David asked thoughtful questions about hospital administration and healthcare policy. Jessica was quiet for most of the tour, but I could see her taking everything in, finally understanding the full scope of the work I did. "This is where you saved my life," Sophie announced when we reached OR3. This is where you fixed my heart. This is where I had the privilege of taking care of you. I corrected. But you saved yourself by being brave enough to tell your parents when you weren't feeling well. At the end of the tour, we gathered in the hospital cafeteria for lunch. Sophie had insisted on trying the food, curious about what doctors and nurses ate during their long shifts. As we sat around the table, I realized that this was the first time my family had seen me in the context of my work life, surrounded by colleagues who knew me as Rodriguez rather than just Emma. I have an announcement, Sophie said, standing up on her chair despite her mother's protests. I want everyone to know that my tia Emma is the best doctor in the whole world, and I'm going to be just like her when I grow up. The cafeteria erupted in applause, and I felt tears prick at my eyes, not because of the praise, but because of the pure joy on Sophie's face, the uncomplicated pride in her voice. She's going to be even better than me, I said, lifting my water glass in a toast, because she's going to be herself. Later that afternoon, after my family had gone home, and I was back in my office catching up on paperwork, I received an email from the hospital's communications department. A local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about women in medicine, and they'd heard about my work with pediatric cardiac surgery. A year ago, I would have declined. I would have suggested another surgeon, someone who was more comfortable with public attention. But now, I found myself typing an acceptance. Not because I wanted the recognition, but because I wanted young girls like Sophie to see that there were women doing this work, that it was possible to build a career in medicine while staying true to yourself. The interview was scheduled for the following week. I made a mental note to ask Sophie if she wanted to be there when the photographer came. She'd probably have questions for the journalist about how newspapers worked, about the process of writing articles, about whether she could be a doctor and a writer at the same time, because that was the thing about Sophie. She didn't see limitations where other people saw obstacles. She saw possibilities where other people saw problems. She was growing up with the understanding that success came in many forms, that happiness could be found in many different kinds of lives. That evening, I was in my apartment reading research papers when my phone rang. It was Jessica. I wanted to thank you for today, she said, for showing us your world, for letting us see who you really are in your professional life. Thank you for coming. It meant a lot to me. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about it. She's been drawing pictures of operating rooms and making lists of all the things she wants to study. She's going to be incredible at whatever she decides to do. I know. And Emma. Jessica paused. I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you are, for the way you've stayed true to yourself even when it was difficult. The words hit me deeper than I'd expected. For years I'd wanted to hear Jessica say that she was proud of me, that she understood the choices I'd made. But now that she'd said it, I realized that I didn't need her approval to feel good about my life. I'd already learned to be proud of myself. Thank you, I said. That means everything to me. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built for myself. My medical books, my research papers, my simple furniture, my herb garden on the balcony. It wasn't the life anyone else had planned for me, but it was exactly the life I wanted. I thought about the girl I'd been in medical school, driven by a desire to help people but unsure whether she was strong enough to handle the pressure of surgery. I thought about the resident I'd been, working impossible hours and learning to make life or death decisions. I thought about the young attending who had been offered her first job, and had chosen Metro General not because it was the most prestigious option, but because it felt like home. Every choice I'd made had led me to this moment, to this life, to this understanding of who I was and what I wanted. I'd spent years hiding parts of myself, but I'd never stopped being authentic to my core values. I'd never compromised on the things that mattered most to me. The phone rang again, and this time it was Sophie. Tia Emma, she said, her voice excited. I have a question. What's your question, sweetheart? Do you think I'm too young to start reading medical journals? I laughed, picturing her surrounded by textbooks and research papers, trying to understand concepts that most adults found challenging. I think you're exactly the right age to start reading whatever interests you, I said, but maybe we should start with some books that are written for people who are learning about medicine for the first time. Like what? I have some idea. How about I bring you some books this weekend, and we can read them together. Really? You'd do that? Of course. And Sophie, I'm proud of you for being curious, for asking questions, for wanting to learn about everything. I learned that from you, she said simply. You never stopped asking questions, even when other people didn't understand why you wanted to know things. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, thinking about the conversation. Sophie was right. I had never stopped asking questions, never stopped being curious about the world around me. That curiosity had led me to medicine, had driven me to specialize in cardiac surgery, had motivated me to do research and develop new techniques. But more than that, it had led me to question the assumptions that other people made about success and happiness. It had given me the courage to choose a life that felt authentic to me, even when that life didn't match other people's expectations. I was Dr. Emma Rodriguez, Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery at Metro General Hospital. I was Sophie's aunt and soon-to-be godmother. I was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman who had learned to be proud of herself exactly as she was. The secret was out, the truth was known, and I was finally completely authentically myself, and that was more than enough. 6 months had passed since that transformative night in the emergency room, and the Arizona winter was finally beginning to soften into the promise of spring. I stood at the window of my office, watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot, when my assistant's voice came through the intercom. Dr. Rodriguez, your family is here for the 10 o'clock appointment. I smiled, still getting used to the idea that my family would voluntarily come to the hospital to see me. Today was special though. Sophie had her 6-month post-surgical follow-up, and she'd insisted that everyone come along to hear the result. The examination room buzzed with quiet energy, as Sophie sat on the table, swinging her legs while I listened to her heart through my stethoscope. The sound was perfect, strong, steady, with no trace of the irregular rhythm that had brought her to me months ago. Her surgical scar had healed beautifully, barely visible now as a thin pink line on her chest. Everything sounds perfect, I announced, and the relief in the room was palpable. Her heart is functioning exactly as it should, no restrictions on activity, no special precautions needed. Sophie pumped her fist in the air. Can I try out for the competitive soccer team now? You can try out for whatever you want, I said, ruffling her hair. Your heart is completely healed. Jessica had tears in her eyes as she hugged Sophie tightly. The past 6 months had changed her in ways that went far beyond her daughter's recovery. She'd left her pharmaceutical sales job 3 months ago and was now halfway through a social work program at Arizona State University. The transformation in her demeanor was remarkable. She seemed more relaxed, more genuine, more at peace with herself. There's something else, Sophie said, reaching into her backpack and pulling out a thick folder. I wanted to show you my science fair project. She spread the materials across the examination table with the enthusiasm of a child who had discovered something wonderful. The project was titled How Hearts Work and How Doctors Fix Them, and it was surprisingly sophisticated for a 9-year-old's work. I interviewed 3 different cardiac surgeons, Sophie explained proudly. Dr. Chen from Phoenix Children's Hospital, Dr. Patel from Banner Health, and of course, you. I wanted to understand how many different ways there are to fix heart. I looked through her research, impressed by the depth of her investigation. She'd created detailed diagrams of heart anatomy, explained different types of congenital defects, and even included a timeline of cardiac surgery innovations throughout history. This is incredible work, Sophie. What did you learn? I learned that being a doctor isn't just about knowing medical stuff, she said thoughtfully. It's about caring about people and wanting to help them feel better. And I learned that there are lots of different ways to help people, not just surgery. Jessica caught my eye and smiled. We'd had several conversations about Sophie's growing interest in medicine, and Jessica had been careful not to push her daughter in any particular direction. She'd learned from watching my journey that success came in many forms, and that the most important thing was for Sophie to follow her own path. Speaking of helping people, David said, we have some news to share. He looked at Jessica, who nodded encouragingly. Jessica got accepted into the graduate social work program at ASU. She's going to specialize in family counseling. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely pleased. How does it feel, Scary, Jessica admitted. I'm going back to school at 32, starting over in a field where I'll make a fraction of what I used to make, but it feels right in a way that my old job never did. My mother, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, spoke up. We're very proud of Jessica for following her heart, just like we're proud of Emma for following hers. The simple statement carried the weight of years of misunderstanding finally resolved. My parents had spent months processing the revelation of my career, asking questions they'd never thought to ask before, learning about the work I did, and why it mattered to me. They'd begun to understand that success wasn't just about external markers, but about finding fulfillment in work that aligned with your values. There's something I want to tell all of you, I said, deciding that this was the right moment to share news I'd been keeping to myself. I've been asked to head up a new pediatric cardiac program that will serve the entire Southwest region. We're going to be training surgeons from other hospitals, developing new techniques, and providing specialized care for the most complex cases. The room erupted in congratulations, but I held up my hand to continue. I wanted to tell you because this is exactly the kind of opportunity that Jessica used to suggest I should be looking for. More responsibility, higher profile, greater recognition. And a year ago I might have turned it down because I was afraid of what success would mean for my family relationships. I looked around the room at these people who had learned to see me clearly for the first time in years. But I'm accepting the position because it's the right next step for my career, and because I know now that I don't have to choose between professional success and personal authenticity. I can be ambitious and still be myself. Sophie clapped her hands together. Does this mean you'll be teaching other doctors how to fix hearts? That's exactly what it means. Can I come watch sometime? I promise I'll be quiet and I won't touch anything. The request made everyone laugh, but I could see the genuine curiosity in her eye. We'll see what we can arrange. After the appointment, my family headed home, but Sophie lingered behind, tugging on my white coat. Tia, Emma, can I ask you something private? I knelt down to her level. Of course, sweetheart. Sometimes I feel different from other kids. Like I think about things they don't think about, or I'm interested in stuff they think is boring. Does that mean something's wrong with me? The question broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. Here was this brilliant, curious child worried that her intelligence and depth made her somehow defective. Sophie, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. Being different isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a gift to be celebrated. Some of the most important people in the world are the ones who think differently, who ask questions other people don't ask, who see possibilities where others see obstacles. She considered this seriously. Is that why you became a doctor? Because you thought differently? I became a doctor because I cared about helping people, and I stayed in medicine because I found work that challenged me and made me feel like I was making a difference. But yes, part of my journey involved learning that it's okay to want different things than what other people expect you to want. Mom says you were brave to live your life the way you wanted to, even when other people didn't understand. I thought about that characterization. Had I been brave, or had I just been stubborn? Had I been protecting my authenticity, or had I been avoiding difficult conversations? I think I was trying to be true to myself, I said finally. Sometimes that requires courage, and sometimes it just requires patience. I want to be true to myself too, Sophie said, with the seriousness that only children could bring to profound statements. Then that's exactly what you should do. And Sophie, if you ever feel like the adults in your life don't understand who you are, or what you want, you can always talk to me. I promise I'll listen without trying to change you. She hugged me tightly, and I felt the weight of responsibility that came with being a role model for this remarkable child. Sophie would face her own challenges as she grew up, her own moments of having to choose between fitting in and being authentic, but she would also have the advantage of seeing that it was possible to live life on your own terms. Later that evening, I was at home preparing for a presentation I was giving the next day when my phone rang. It was Dr. Sarah Kim, calling from the hospital. Emma, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but we have a situation. Remember that complex case we've been consulting? The infant with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. The parents want to transfer the baby here specifically to have you perform the surgery. I set down my presentation notes,
my mind immediately shifting into medical mode. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome was one of the most challenging conditions in pediatric cardiac surgery, requiring a series of operations to essentially reconstruct how blood flowed through the heart. What's the timeline? They want to do the transfer tomorrow. The baby is stable for now, but she'll need the first stage surgery within the week. I thought about my schedule, about the new program I was developing, about the administrative responsibilities that came with my expanded role. A year ago, I might have referred this case to another surgeon, might have decided that my plate was too full to take on such a complex case, but this was exactly why I'd gone into pediatric cardiac surgery. For the babies who needed someone with my specific expertise, for the families who were facing the unimaginable challenge of watching their child fight for life. Schedule it, I said. And Sarah, let's use this case as one of the first training opportunities for the new program. We can have surgeons from other hospitals observe, use it as a teaching case. You sure? It's going to be a lot of pressure, I'm sure. These are the cases that matter most. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. From the girl who had wanted to help people to the surgeon who was now being entrusted with the most complex cases. From the woman who had hidden her success, to the doctor who was about to lead a regional program. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, built on years of small choices to be authentic, to pursue work that mattered, to define success on my own terms. The revelation to my family had been just one part of a longer journey toward living fully as myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Thank you for today. Sophie is so excited about your new position. She's already making plans to be your first trainee in about 15 years. I smiled, imagining Sophie as a medical student, full of questions and determination, and that same fearless curiosity she showed now. Whether she ultimately chose medicine or some other path, she would have the advantage of growing up with the understanding that success came in many forms, that authenticity was more valuable than approval, that it was possible to build a life that felt true to who you were. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early to prepare for the infant's arrival. The case would be challenging, requiring multiple surgeries over several years, but the outcome could be extraordinary. This baby could grow up to live a full, normal life if everything went according to plan. As I reviewed the medical records and imaging studies, I thought about the responsibility I carry, not just for this one patient, but for all the children who would benefit from the new program I was developing, for all the surgeons I would train, for all the families who would trust me with their most precious gifts. The infant arrived by medical helicopter just after noon, accompanied by parents who looked exhausted and terrified. They were young, probably not much older than I had been when I'd started medical school, facing a situation no parent should ever have to face. Dr. Rodriguez, the mother said, when I introduced myself, we heard you're the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the region. Please, can you save our daughter? I looked down at the tiny baby in the transport incubator, so small and fragile, fighting for every breath. This was why I'd become a surgeon, why I'd specialized in pediatric cardiac surgery, why I'd spent years developing the skills and expertise that could make the difference between life and death. I'm going to do everything in my power to help your daughter, I said. She's going to need multiple surgeries over the next few years, but children with her condition can grow up to live normal, healthy lives. The surgery took 8 hours. It was technically perfect, exactly the kind of complex procedure that required every bit of training and experience I'd accumulated over the years. When I finally stepped out of the operating room to talk to the parents, I felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that came with successfully completing a life-saving surgery. The first stage reconstruction was successful, I told them. Your daughter tolerated the surgery beautifully, and her heart is functioning well with the repairs we made. The relief on their faces was overwhelming. The mother collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing with gratitude and exhaustion. These were the moments that made everything else worthwhile. The long hours, the constant pressure, the weight of responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in your hand. As I walked back through the hospital corridors, I encountered several of the surgeons who had come to observe the procedure. They were talking excitedly about the techniques I'd used, the innovative approaches I'd taken to solve particularly challenging aspects of the reconstruction. Rodriguez, one of them called out. That was incredible. I've never seen that modification to the Norwood procedure before. Where did you learn that technique? I developed it, I said simply, based on some research I've been doing on optimizing blood flow in single ventricle reconstruction. The conversation that followed was exactly the kind of professional exchange that energized me. Colleagues who understood the work, who appreciated the complexity of what we did, who were eager to learn and improve their own skills. This was my world, my profession, my calling, and for the first time in years I was able to inhabit it fully, without hiding any part of who I was, or apologizing for the choices I'd made. Later that evening, I called Sophie to tell her about the surgery. She listened with rapt attention as I explained what I'd done, asking thoughtful questions about the procedure and the baby's prognosis. Will you be able to fix her heart completely? She asked. She'll need 2 more surgeries as she grows, but yes, we should be able to give her a heart that works normally for the rest of her life. That's amazing. You're like a superhero, but real. The comparison made me laugh, but it also made me think about the responsibility that came with being someone's hero. Sophie looked up to me now in a way she never had before, and I wanted to be worthy of that admiration. Sophie, the most important thing isn't being amazing at your job. The most important thing is finding work that makes you feel like you're making a difference, work that uses your talents in ways that matter to you. Is that why you love being a surgeon? That's exactly why I love being a surgeon. As we talked, I could hear Jessica in the background, probably listening to every word. My relationship with my sister had transformed completely over the past 6 months. Where there had once been tension and misunderstanding, there was now genuine respect and affection. Jessica had learned to see success differently, and I had learned to share my life more openly. We were both different people than we'd been 6 months ago, shaped by the experience of finally seeing each other clearly. The truth had set us all free, but more than that, it had brought us closer together as a family. We were learning to love each other not despite our differences, but because of that. We were learning that there were many ways to be successful, many ways to be happy, many ways to make a life worth living. And Sophie was growing up with the understanding that she could be anything she wanted to be, as long as she had the courage to be authentically herself. That night, as I sat on my balcony looking out at the Phoenix skyline, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. She had been successful, accomplished, respected in her field, but she had also been hiding, protecting herself from expectations and judgments that might not have been as harsh as she'd imagined. Now I was the same person, but living more fully, more openly, more authentically. I was Emma Rodriguez, Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, soon to be director of a regional pediatric cardiac program. I was Sophie's aunt and role model, Jessica's sister and friend, my parents' daughter who had finally learned to be proud of herself. The secret was out, the truth was known, and I was finally, completely, authentically myself.
And that was everything I'd ever wanted to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.